The mind of an 11-year-old child is not equipped to process the kind of terror that transforms a routine walk to the school bus into the last moment of freedom she'll know for nearly 2 decades. As an FBI profiler who has spent 30 years studying the psychology of both predators and survivors, I've analyzed thousands of cases, but none have haunted me quite like Jaycee Dugard's. The mechanisms her young mind created to survive 18 years of captivity reveal something profound about human resilience and something deeply disturbing about how evil can flourish in suburbia's shadow. It was a Tuesday morning in South Lake Tahoe when Jaycee's childhood ended with the screech of tires and a stun gun's electric crackle. Philip Garrido had been watching, planning, circling like a predator who understood that opportunity and preparation would eventually align. What he couldn't have anticipated was the extraordinary psychological fortress his 11-year-old victim would construct to survive what he intended to destroy her with. When we study abduction cases, we look for patterns in both the perpetrator's behavior and the victim's response. Garrido fit a profile we know well: the inadequate male seeking complete control over another human being, someone who had already demonstrated his capacity for violence through previous convictions. His wife, Nancy, represented another familiar archetype, the passive enabler whose own psychological fractures allowed her to participate in unthinkable acts. Together, they created what we call a captivity ecosystem, a closed environment where normal social rules cease to exist. But Jaycee's response defied many of our expectations about how children adapt to prolonged trauma. Rather than complete psychological breakdown, she developed what I can only describe as a dual consciousness. Part of her mind accepted the reality of her captivity, learning to navigate its dangers and demands. Another part carefully preserved her essential self, tucking away memories of her mother, her pink bedroom, her dreams of growing up normal. This compartmentalization likely saved her sanity. The backyard compound where Jaycee spent her stolen years was a physical manifestation of Garrido's delusions, but it also became the laboratory where a child's mind learned to perform impossible calculations. How much resistance was too much? How much compliance was survival? When Garrido's sexual abuse resulted in pregnancies, Jaycee faced scenarios no training manual could prepare us to analyze. At 14, she became a mother while still psychologically protecting the 11-year-old self, frozen in time. What strikes me most about Jaycee's case is how she managed to maintain her capacity for love despite being surrounded by its complete absence. When she gave birth to daughters Angel and Starlet in that backyard hell, she somehow accessed maternal instincts that trauma should have destroyed. She created moments of normalcy for her children, makeshift lessons, bedtime stories, protection from the worst of Garrido's instability. In psychological terms, she was simultaneously victim and protector, child and mother, broken and remarkably whole. The outside world continued searching, of course. Jaycee's face appeared on milk cartons and missing children websites. Law enforcement followed thousands of leads that led nowhere. But Garrido had chosen his hiding place carefully, a suburban neighborhood where screams might be explained away as television shows, where high fences were normal, where people minded their own business. The most monstrous crimes often occur not in dark alleys but in plain sight, camouflaged by landscaping and the assumption that evil announces itself more dramatically. For 18 years, this arrangement persisted. Garrido's paranoid fantasies evolved and multiplied. Nancy continued her silent complicity, and Jaycee grew from child to woman while learning to survive in psychological conditions that would challenge our understanding of human adaptability. She witnessed the outside world only through glimpses, a delivery truck, an airplane overhead, the distant sound of children playing in freedom she could barely remember. When freedom finally came in August 2009, it arrived not through the massive law enforcement effort that had searched for her, but through Garrido's own deteriorating grip on reality. His increasing boldness, his need to bring his daughters into public spaces, ultimately led to the questions that unraveled his carefully constructed deception. a university police officer's instincts, honed by years of recognizing when something felt wrong, provided the thread that pulled apart nearly 2 decades of hidden horror. But that moment of rescue, which the world celebrated as a miracle, represented for Jaycee perhaps the most psychologically complex transition imaginable. The captivity that had defined her reality since childhood was suddenly gone, replaced by a freedom she had to relearn how to navigate. The survival mechanisms that had kept her alive now had to be carefully dismantled. The compartmentalized mind that had protected her essential self needed to slowly, carefully integrate years of trauma with the possibility of healing. Today, as Jaycee courageously shares her story, she offers something invaluable to our understanding of human resilience. Her survival represents more than just endurance. It demonstrates the mind's remarkable ability to preserve hope in absolute darkness, to find ways to love when surrounded by hatred, to maintain humanity when confronted with its complete absence. The mind of an 11-year-old operates on different principles than an adult's. When faced with incomprehensible horror, children don't possess the cognitive framework to process trauma the way mature minds do. This fundamental truth became the key to understanding how Jaycee Dugard survived nearly 2 decades in captivity. FBI Special Agent Rebecca Martinez had spent 15 years profiling predators and their victims, but the Dugard case challenged everything she thought she knew about psychological adaptation. Sitting across from Jaycee in a quiet conference room at the Victim Services Center, Martinez observed a woman whose calm demeanor masked layers of complex survival mechanisms that had been constructed over years of unthinkable circumstances. "People ask me how I survived," Jaycee said, her voice steady but distant. "They expect some dramatic story of resistance or escape attempts. But survival isn't always about fighting back. Sometimes it's about becoming someone else entirely." The transformation had begun almost immediately after Philip and Nancy Garrido transported her to their compound in Antioch, California. The terrified 6th grader, who had been walking to her school bus stop that June morning in South Lake Tahoe, essentially ceased to exist. In her place emerged a psychological chameleon, adapting moment by moment to an environment where predicting her captor's moods meant the difference between relative safety and violence. "Philip had rules," Jaycee explained, her fingers unconsciously tracing patterns on the table. Hundreds of them. When to speak, when to stay silent, how to sit, how to stand. But the rules changed depending on his mental state, his drug use, his delusions. Nancy followed his lead, sometimes cruel, sometimes almost protective. Reading them became my full-time job. Agent Martinez recognized the hypervigilance that Jaycee described, a common adaptation among long-term captives. But what struck her was how Jaycee had weaponized this survival trait, turning it into a sophisticated early warning system. She learned to detect the subtlest changes in Philip's voice that preceded violent episodes. She memorized Nancy's facial expressions to gauge whether she might intervene or participate in abuse. The compound where Jaycee spent her captivity was a maze of sheds, tents, and makeshift rooms hidden behind the Garrido suburban home. To neighbors, Philip appeared eccentric but harmless, a registered sex offender who seemed to be complying with his parole requirements. They had no idea that behind the overgrown backyard lay a secret world where a missing child was being systematically broken down and rebuilt according to her captor's twisted vision. "I became useful to them," Jaycee continued, her clinical tone suggesting she had told this story many times to therapists and investigators. Not just for Philip's sexual gratification, but as a companion for Nancy, as a caretaker when I got older. They created dependency, but I learned to use that dependency as protection. The psychological manipulation had been sophisticated and relentless. Philip convinced Jaycee that her family had stopped looking for her, that law enforcement had given up, that returning to the outside world would mean rejection and shame. He presented himself as her savior rather than her captor, someone who understood her better than her biological family ever could. But children's minds are remarkably adaptable, and Jaycee's psyche had split the difference between compliance and preservation. While outwardly accepting her captor's version of reality, some essential part of her remained separate, observing, cataloguing, waiting. She developed an internal narrator who could watch her circumstances with detached clarity, even while her body endured abuse. "I remember thinking about my mom," Jaycee said, "not obsessively because that would have driven me crazy. But I kept her face somewhere safe in my mind. I told myself stories about what she might be doing. It was like maintaining a small flame that I couldn't let the wind blow out." The birth of her 2 daughters, both fathered by Philip, had complicated her survival calculus immeasurably. Suddenly, she wasn't just protecting herself, but 2 innocent lives who depended entirely on her ability to navigate their captor's unpredictability. Motherhood had given her strength, but also created new vulnerabilities that Philip exploited ruthlessly. Agent Martinez had seen this pattern before, captives who might have attempted escape or resistance when responsible only for themselves, becoming completely compliant when children entered the equation. The maternal instinct, rather than motivating desperate action, often created additional chains stronger than any physical restraint. "The girls never knew it wasn't normal," Jaycee explained. "That was both heartbreaking and protective. They thought all families lived like we did. I tried to give them as much childhood as I could within those boundaries." As their conversation continued, Martinez marveled at the psychological architecture that had allowed Jaycee to endure, layer upon layer of adaptations, compartmentalizations, and small acts of resistance that had preserved her sanity while keeping her alive. It was a masterclass in human resilience, built by a child who never should have needed such skills. The question that haunted Martinez was whether the same psychological flexibility that had ensured Jaycee's survival might now complicate her recovery in ways no one fully understood. The mind of a predator operates on patterns that most people cannot fathom, and Philip Garrido had been perfecting his for years before he ever laid eyes on Jaycee Lee Dugard. FBI profiler Dr. Sarah Chen had spent 3 decades studying cases like this one, but the meticulous planning behind Jaycee's abduction still sent chills down her spine as she reviewed the case files in her Quantico office. "What people don't understand," Dr. Chen explained, adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses as she pulled up surveillance footage from the morning of June 10, 1991, "is that this wasn't a crime of opportunity. Garrido had been watching, learning, preparing. The location, the timing, even the pink jumpsuit he wore to appear less threatening, it was all calculated." The grainy footage showed a residential street in South Lake Tahoe, quiet and tree-lined, the kind of neighborhood where children should be safe walking to school. Garrido had studied this route, had observed the patterns of the community, had identified Jaycee as his target weeks before striking. The banality of the setting made the crime even more chilling, evil lurking behind the facade of suburban normalcy. "Predators like Garrido are master manipulators," Dr. Chen continued, her voice steady despite the horrific nature of her work. "They understand vulnerability. They know how to exploit trust, and most importantly, they're experts at hiding in plain sight." Nancy Garrido's involvement wasn't incidental, it was strategic. A woman's presence would make Jaycee feel safer, more compliant. The morning had started like any other for 11-year-old Jaycee. She'd kissed her mother Terry goodbye, grabbed her backpack, and begun the familiar walk to the school bus stop. But Garrido had been waiting, cruising the neighborhood in his gray sedan, Nancy beside him, both of them playing their rehearsed roles in a nightmare that would unfold over 18 years. The actual abduction took less than 60 seconds. Garrido used a stun gun, rendering Jaycee helpless before she could even scream. Witnesses reported hearing what sounded like a car backfiring, but by the time anyone looked, the sedan was disappearing around a corner, carrying its precious cargo toward a fate no child should ever endure. The immediate aftermath of an abduction is crucial, Dr. Chen noted, pulling up psychological studies on victim behavior. Children like Jaycee enter what we call survival mode. their minds begin adapting to impossible circumstances in ways that adults often misunderstand. What might look like compliance or even acceptance is actually a sophisticated psychological defense mechanism. Within hours of the abduction, Jaycee found herself in a world that defied comprehension. The Garridos transported her to their property in Antioch, California, where Philip had constructed an elaborate prison disguised as a backyard compound. Hidden behind the main house, concealed by tarps, trees, and deliberate neglect, was a series of sheds and tents that would become Jaycee's universe for nearly 2 decades. The psychological manipulation began immediately. Garrido, a registered sex offender with a history of violent crime, understood that physical restraints alone wouldn't guarantee long-term control. He needed to break down Jaycee's sense of identity, her connection to her previous life, her hope of rescue. He told her that her family had stopped looking for her, that she was forgotten, that he was now the most important person in her world. Isolation is the predator's most powerful weapon, Dr. Chen explained. Cut off from external reality, victims begin to depend on their captors for basic information about the world. Garrido controlled every piece of information Jaycee received, what day it was, what was happening in the outside world, even whether her family still existed. Nancy Garrido's role in this psychological prison was particularly insidious. While Philip was the primary abuser, Nancy served as a twisted maternal figure, providing just enough care and comfort to create a confusing emotional dependency. She would tend to Jaycee during illnesses, provide small kindnesses that felt enormous in the context of their isolated world, and gradually normalize the abnormal circumstances of their daily life. The compound itself was a masterpiece of concealment. Neighbors lived just yards away, yet remained completely unaware that a kidnapped child was being held captive behind layers of tarps and debris. Garrido had created multiple buildings, some for housing, others for his delusional religious activities, all connected by a maze of pathways that kept Jaycee disoriented and dependent. What's particularly chilling about this case, Dr. Chen observed, is how Garrido managed to maintain the illusion of normalcy to the outside world while constructing this elaborate prison. He was a registered sex offender, yes, but he attended parole meetings, maintained relationships with neighbors, even ran a small business. The compartmentalization required for this level of deception speaks to a deeply disturbed but highly functional criminal mind. As months turned to years, Jaycee's psychological survival mechanisms evolved and deepened. She learned to read Garrido's moods, to anticipate his needs, to become indispensable to the functioning of their twisted household. It was adaptation born of necessity, the mind's desperate attempt to survive circumstances that should have been unsurvivable. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Special Agent Sarah Chen spread the case files across the conference table. 23 years of law enforcement experience had taught her to compartmentalize, but the Dugard case still made her stomach clench. She adjusted her reading glasses and looked across at the documentary crew, their cameras capturing every micro-expression that crossed her weathered face. People always ask me how someone like Philip Garrido slips through the cracks for so long, Chen began, her voice steady despite the weight of what she was about to reveal. The answer isn't comfortable. He didn't slip through anything. The system wasn't designed to catch predators who understand how to manipulate it. She pulled out a thick psychological profile, pages yellowed with age and marked with countless annotations in different colored ink. We built this profile in 1991, right after Jaycee disappeared. Everything we predicted about her captor turned out to be horrifyingly accurate. The problem wasn't our understanding of the perpetrator. The problem was that Garrido had spent decades perfecting his ability to appear normal. Chen's fingers traced over crime scene photographs, her expression distant as she recalled those early months of the investigation. Garrido wasn't some wild-eyed monster living in complete isolation. He had neighbors, he interacted with parole officers, he ran a small business. Nancy went grocery shopping and made small talk with cashiers. They existed in society while holding a child prisoner in their backyard. The weight of institutional failure pressed heavily in the room. Chen had interviewed dozens of people who had encountered the Garridos over the years, and the pattern was always the same. Something felt off, but not off enough to warrant serious investigation. The most chilling aspect of this case, Chen continued, is how Garrido used psychological conditioning to ensure Jaycee's compliance. He didn't need physical restraints after the initial period because he had created mental ones that were far more effective. She opened another file, this one containing transcripts from Jaycee's interviews after her rescue. Jaycee told us that Garrido would describe in graphic detail what would happen to her daughters if she ever tried to escape or seek help. He made her complicit in her own captivity by giving her something precious to protect. It's a manipulation tactic we see in the most sophisticated long-term abduction cases. Chen paused, removing her glasses to clean them, a gesture that betrayed the emotional toll of revisiting these details. What people don't understand is that Jaycee wasn't just surviving physical abuse. She was navigating an impossible psychological maze where every decision could mean life or death, not just for herself, but for her children. The profiler pulled out surveillance photos from the period before Jaycee's rescue, images that showed her in public with Garrido and Nancy. Look at these pictures from 2009, just months before she was found. Jaycee is right there, in broad daylight, at his business events. But she's not trying to escape or signal for help. This isn't Stockholm Syndrome, which is what people always assume. This is a trauma response to sustained psychological terrorism. Chen's voice grew harder, more clinical, as she detailed the systematic way Garrido had dismantled an 11-year-old girl's understanding of reality. He convinced her that the outside world had forgotten her, that her family had given up searching, that she was safer with him than anywhere else. He showed her newspaper clippings about other missing children who were found dead, reinforcing the narrative that escape meant death. The documentary director leaned forward, asking the question that haunted everyone who studied the case. How does someone rebuild their identity after such comprehensive psychological destruction? That's the part that keeps me awake at night, Chen admitted. Jaycee lost her entire adolescence, her formative years, to systematic brainwashing. She missed every developmental milestone that teaches us who we are, separate from our family of origin. When she was rescued, she had to rebuild her sense of self from scratch while simultaneously learning to be a mother to traumatized children and processing her own unimaginable trauma. Chen gathered the files slowly, each document representing hours of painstaking investigation and analysis. What Jaycee accomplished, just by surviving with her core humanity intact, is extraordinary. Most people would have completely fractured under that level of sustained psychological assault. The fact that she's now able to speak about her experience, to help others understand what survival looks like, represents a kind of strength that we don't have adequate words for. As the cameras stopped rolling, Chen sat quietly for a moment, staring at the empty conference table. She had profiled serial killers and studied the darkest corners of human behavior, but the Dugard case remained unique in its demonstration of both ultimate evil and ultimate resilience. Somewhere in California, a woman who should have been broken beyond repair was instead choosing to rebuild, to reclaim her story, and to transform her survival into a beacon for others lost in similar darkness. The morning mist clung to the hills of Antioch as FBI profiler Dr. Sarah Chen reviewed the case files one more time. 20 years in behavioral analysis had prepared her for the darkest corners of human psychology, but the Garrido case still haunted her professional consciousness. She adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses and spoke into the documentary camera with the measured precision of someone who had testified in countless courtrooms. When we examine predators like Philip Garrido, we're looking at a perfect storm of psychological pathology, she began, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. Sexual sadists don't typically maintain captives for 18 years. The logistics alone should have been impossible, but Garrido possessed a specific combination of narcissistic personality disorder, sexual deviance, and what we call ownership fantasy that created the conditions for long-term captivity. The case files spread across her desk told a story that defied conventional criminal profiling. Garrido's criminal history stretched back decades. A rape conviction in 1976 that should have kept him imprisoned far longer than the 11 years he actually served. The system had failed spectacularly, releasing a man whose psychological profile screamed danger to society. What made Garrido particularly dangerous was his ability to compartmentalize, Chen continued, turning to a photograph of the Antioch property where Jaycee had been held. He functioned in society while maintaining this elaborate fantasy world in his backyard. His neighbors saw an eccentric man with a religious fixation. They had no idea that behind the tarps and sheds he was operating what amounted to a private prison. The psychological manipulation began immediately upon Jaycee's abduction. Chen had studied similar cases, Elizabeth Fritzl in Austria, the Cleveland kidnappings, but Garrido's methods were particularly insidious. He combined physical restraint with psychological conditioning, creating what experts called learned helplessness on an unprecedented scale. Jaycee was 11 when she was taken, Chen explained, her clinical tone unable to mask the underlying tragedy. At that age, the brain is still developing crucial neural pathways. Garrido essentially rewired her understanding of normal human relationships. He became her entire world, captor, abuser, but also provider of basic needs. This created a trauma bond that's incredibly difficult for outsiders to understand. The backyard compound evolved over the years into an elaborate maze of sheds, tarps, and fencing. Garrido's paranoia worked in his favor, creating multiple barriers that prevented escape while appearing to neighbors as the eccentric projects of an odd but harmless man. The psychological prison he constructed was even more effective than the physical one. Survivors often ask themselves why they didn't run when opportunities presented themselves, Chen said, pulling up crime scene photographs that showed the complex layout of the property. But Garrido had convinced Jaycee that the outside world had forgotten her, that her family had given up searching. He created an alternate reality where he was her only source of safety and connection. Nancy Garrido's role in the captivity presented its own psychological puzzle. Chen had interviewed dozens of female accomplices in male-dominated crimes, and Nancy fit a familiar pattern, the dependent personality type who becomes completely subsumed by a dominant partner's will. Nancy wasn't just complicit, she was essential to maintaining the illusion of normalcy, Chen observed. She helped manage the day-to-day aspects of keeping three people hidden, while maintaining the facade of a quirky but harmless couple. Her presence likely prevented neighbors from becoming suspicious about Philip's activities. The birth of Jaycee's daughters added another layer of psychological complexity to the captivity. Garrido's delusions of grandeur led him to believe he was creating some kind of family unit, but the reality was far more sinister. He was ensuring that Jaycee would never try to escape by giving her children she couldn't bear to leave behind. When victims have children in captivity, the psychological chains become nearly unbreakable, Chen explained. Jaycee wasn't just protecting herself anymore. She was protecting two innocent lives who depended entirely on her for survival. Garrido understood this dynamic and exploited it ruthlessly. The religious delusions that characterized Garrido's later years provided him with internal justification for his actions. He began to believe he was chosen by God for special purposes, that his crimes were actually part of some divine plan. This psychological evolution made him even more dangerous, as it removed any remaining constraints of conscience or guilt. Predators like Garrido often develop elaborate internal mythologies to justify their actions, Chen noted. By the time of his arrest, he genuinely believed he had saved Jaycee, that he was some kind of prophet. This level of self-delusion is characteristic of long-term sexual offenders who avoid detection. Chen closed the case file and looked directly into the camera. What's remarkable about Jaycee's survival isn't just that she endured 18 years of captivity. It's that she managed to maintain enough of her core self to eventually reintegrate into society, That speaks to an incredible strength of spirit that even someone as manipulative and controlling as Philip Garrido couldn't completely destroy. The psychological landscape of the Garrido case would continue to provide insights into predatory behavior for years to come, but for Chen, it would always represent something more personal, a reminder of human resilience in the face of unimaginable evil. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the sterile FBI conference room as Special Agent Robert Martinez spread the case files across the mahogany table. 23 years of law enforcement had taught him to compartmentalize, to analyze predatory behavior with clinical detachment, but the Dugard case still made his jaw clench involuntarily. The psychological profile we developed in 1991 was textbook for stranger abduction cases, Martinez explained, his weathered hands pointing to faded photographs and typed reports. We were looking for a disorganized offender, likely operating within a 5-mile radius of the abduction site, someone impulsive, probably acting alone. He paused, shaking his head. We were wrong on almost every count. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the blinds as Martinez pulled out a thick folder marked Garrido Philip Craig. Inside were decades of missed opportunities, overlooked warning signs, and a system that failed spectacularly. Philip Garrido wasn't your typical predator, Martinez continued. He was organized, methodical, and had an accomplice. His wife Nancy wasn't just a passive bystander, she was an active participant in maintaining the illusion of normalcy that kept Jaycee hidden for 18 years. The profile that emerged after Jaycee's rescue painted a picture of calculated manipulation that chilled even seasoned investigators. Garrido had spent years perfecting his ability to blend into suburban anonymity while constructing an elaborate prison in his backyard. The makeshift compound of tents and sheds, hidden behind high fences and overgrown vegetation, existed just yards away from neighbors who remained oblivious to the horror unfolding next door. What we learned about Jaycee's psychological survival mechanisms was extraordinary, Martinez said, his voice softening slightly. She developed what we call adaptive dissociation, the ability to mentally separate herself from her physical reality during the worst moments of abuse. It's a trauma response that likely saved her sanity. The files revealed that Jaycee had created an internal world where she could retreat when the external one became unbearable. She would imagine herself back in her bedroom at home, or picture her mother's face, or replay memories from before her abduction. This psychological escape hatch allowed her mind to survive what her body endured. Stockholm Syndrome is often misunderstood, Martinez explained. It's not about loving your captor, it's about survival. Jaycee learned to read Garrido's moods, to anticipate his needs, to become whatever version of herself would keep her alive another day. She developed an almost supernatural ability to sense danger and diffuse volatile situations. The transformation was documented in Garrido's own twisted journals, recovered after his arrest. His writings revealed how Jaycee had gradually taken on a caretaking role within the compound, not just for herself, but later for her 2 daughters born in captivity. She became their protector, their teacher, their entire world. The most remarkable aspect of Jaycee's psychological adaptation was her ability to maintain hope, Martinez continued, pulling out a photograph of the backyard compound taken during the investigation. Despite 18 years of captivity, she never stopped believing that someday she would be free. That belief system, what psychologists call temporal optimism, created a psychological anchor that kept her tethered to her true identity. The turning point came when Garrido's paranoid delusions began escalating. His increasingly erratic behavior around his parole officers and campus security at UC Berkeley created the opportunities that would eventually lead to Jaycee's rescue. But it was Jaycee herself who provided the crucial information that confirmed her identity. When she finally told investigators her name, it was the first time she had spoken it aloud in 18 years, Martinez said quietly. The psychological courage that took after nearly 2 decades of being forced to live as someone else cannot be overstated. The debriefing sessions with Jaycee revealed the complex psychological ecosystem she had created to survive. She had developed elaborate mental exercises to keep her memory sharp, created educational games to teach her daughters, and maintained detailed mental calendars to track the passage of time. These cognitive survival tools demonstrated a level of psychological resilience that impressed even veteran trauma specialists. What struck us most was her clarity about the distinction between survival and acceptance, Martinez noted. Jaycee understood that adapting to her circumstances didn't mean accepting them as permanent. She was playing a long game, making strategic choices that prioritized long-term survival over short-term resistance. The case files also documented the systematic failures that allowed the Garridos to operate undetected for so long. Multiple missed parole visits, ignored neighbor complaints, and a broken monitoring system that should have flagged Garrido's violations years earlier. The investigation revealed a cascade of institutional negligence that enabled the nightmare to continue far longer than it should have. Martinez closed the final folder and leaned back in his chair. Jaycee Dugard survived because she refused to let them destroy who she was at her core. She adapted without surrendering. That distinction between changing and breaking made all the difference. He paused, looking out the window at the fading daylight. She taught us that the human mind's capacity for survival can be stronger than any prison. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit received the Dugard case file in September 1991, 3 months after Jaycee's disappearance. Special Agent Dr. Margaret Chen had spent 15 years studying the minds of predators, but something about this particular abduction felt different from the moment she opened the folder. The witness description troubled me immediately, Dr. Chen recalls, settling into her office chair overlooking Quantico's training grounds. A man and woman working together in a kidnapping? That's exceptionally rare. Less than 2% of stranger abductions involve female accomplices. The witness account was frustratingly brief, but telling. Carl Probin had seen his stepdaughter walking toward her school bus stop when a grey sedan pulled up beside her. A woman's voice called out, then a taser crackled. Jaycee collapsed, was pulled into the vehicle, and vanished. Dr. Chen spread crime scene photographs across her desk, studying the suburban street where it happened. This wasn't random, she determined. Someone had been watching Jaycee, learning her routine. The timing was too precise, the execution too smooth for a crime of opportunity. The psychological profile she developed painted a disturbing picture. The primary offender would be a white male, likely between 30 and 50, with a history of sexual offenses. He would be manipulative, narcissistic, and possess an ability to control others, evidenced by his recruitment of a female accomplice. The woman's participation suggested several possibilities, Dr. Chen explains. She could be another victim, coerced through years of abuse into compliance, or she might be genuinely devoted to the offender, sharing his twisted worldview. Either scenario indicated we were dealing with a sophisticated predator. What haunted Dr. Chen most was the likelihood that Jaycee was still alive. Child predators who kill typically dispose of the body quickly. The fact that we found no remains suggested something far worse, long-term captivity. She recommended expanding the search beyond California's borders and focusing on properties without buildings, basements, or other concealed spaces. The offender would need somewhere to hide his victim, somewhere isolated enough that screams wouldn't be heard. I told Terry Probin and the local investigators to prepare for a marathon, not a sprint, Dr. Chen remembers. These types of cases, when children are taken alive, can go on for years. The perpetrator gets comfortable, develops routines. That's usually when they make mistakes. Months turned to years. Dr. Chen periodically reviewed the case, updating her profile as new investigative techniques emerged. She incorporated geographic profiling, analyzing crime patterns in the South Lake Tahoe area. She studied similar cases nationwide, looking for connections. By the late 1990s, I was consulting on similar abductions across the country, she says. There was the Castro case in Cleveland, several others that never made headlines. A pattern was emerging of long-term captivity situations that law enforcement was ill-equipped to handle. The development of online databases revolutionized their approach. Dr. Chen could now cross-reference thousands of cases, looking for behavioral signatures. She maintained a particular interest in offenders who used female accomplices, building a database that would later prove invaluable. Technology was evolving faster than our understanding of these crimes, she admits. We had all this data but struggled to interpret the psychological dynamics at play. How do you break someone's spirit so completely that they won't even try to escape? How do you maintain control over another human being for years? Dr. Chen began studying Stockholm Syndrome and trauma bonding in captivity situations. She consulted with experts who had worked with prisoners of war, cult survivors, anyone who had endured prolonged psychological manipulation. The human mind's capacity for adaptation is both remarkable and terrifying, she reflects. Victims develop survival strategies that might look like cooperation from the outside, but are actually sophisticated psychological defenses. As Jaycee's case entered its second decade, Dr. Chen faced difficult questions from the family. Was their daughter still alive? Should they hold on to hope? Her answers walked a careful line between honesty and humanity. I told them that every day Jaycee survived was another day for us to find her, Dr. Chen says. But privately, I worried about what condition she might be in after years of captivity. The psychological damage could be irreversible. The breakthrough came in August 2009, 18 years after Dr. Chen first opened the case file. A parole officer's suspicions led to the discovery of a hidden compound behind a suburban house. Two young girls emerged from the backyard, followed by a young woman who quietly said, "My name is Jaycee Lee Dugard." When I got that phone call, I felt vindicated and horrified in equal measure, Dr. Chen recalls. Our profile had been accurate, too accurate. Philip Garrido matched our behavioral analysis perfectly. Nancy Garrido fit the dominated accomplice model precisely. But nothing had prepared Dr. Chen for the complexity of Jaycee's survival story. She had created an entirely different person to endure what happened to her. The psychological mechanisms she developed were unlike anything I'd studied before. She didn't just survive, she protected two children and maintained her essential humanity. The case would reshape how the FBI understood long-term captivity and trauma bonding, becoming a cornerstone study in behavioral analysis training. The psychological patterns we observed in both captors revealed a disturbing symbiosis that had evolved over decades. Nancy Garrido wasn't merely an accomplice. She was a co-architect of Jaycee's imprisonment, though her motivations differed dramatically from her husband's. While Philip's drives were rooted in sexual deviance and control, Nancy's psychology presented a more complex web of delusion, codependency, and maternal transference that made her equally dangerous. Nancy saw herself as Jaycee's protector, explains Dr. Sarah Chen, the FBI's lead behavioral analyst on the case. In her distorted reality, she was saving Jaycee from the outside world, creating a family unit that fulfilled her own deep-seated need for motherhood. This delusion made her complicit in ways that went beyond mere submission to her husband's will. The dynamic between the Garridos demonstrated what we call folie à deux, a shared psychotic disorder where delusions are transmitted from one individual to another. Nancy's mental health history revealed multiple psychiatric hospitalizations and a pattern of submissive relationships with controlling men. When she met Philip in 1973, she was particularly vulnerable, having recently suffered a miscarriage that devastated her hopes of becoming a mother. Philip exploited this vulnerability masterfully. His manipulation techniques followed classic patterns we see in cult leaders and domestic abusers. He isolated Nancy from her family, created financial dependence, and gradually introduced increasingly deviant behaviors while positioning himself as her spiritual guide. By the time he proposed kidnapping a child, Nancy's reality had been so thoroughly distorted that she believed it was part of God's plan for their family. The transformation of the backyard into a prison compound didn't happen overnight, notes retired FBI agent Martinez, who spent months analyzing the crime scene. The progression of structures, from a single shed to multiple tents to eventually soundproofed rooms, shows us how their delusions deepened over time. Each modification represented another step away from reality and deeper into their shared fantasy. The couple's religious delusions played a crucial role in maintaining their psychological equilibrium. Philip claimed to receive divine visions and positioned himself as a prophet tasked with creating a new kind of family. Nancy embraced these delusions because they provided meaning for her otherwise chaotic existence and justified her participation in Jaycee's captivity. She genuinely believed she was helping to fulfill a divine mission. What makes Nancy's psychology particularly chilling is how she compartmentalized her actions. During the day, she would interact with neighbors, hold jobs, and present herself as a somewhat eccentric but harmless woman. In the evening, she would return to the compound where she participated in maintaining Jaycee's imprisonment. This cognitive dissonance required an extraordinary level of psychological fragmentation. The birth of Jaycee's daughters intensified Nancy's delusions rather than awakening her to the horror of the situation. Instead of recognizing the children as evidence of ongoing sexual abuse, Nancy incorporated them into her fantasy of divine family creation. She convinced herself that Jaycee was a willing participant in bringing these blessed children into the world, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Philip's psychology followed more predictable patterns of sexual predation combined with messianic delusions. His previous conviction for rape in 1976 had resulted in federal prison time, where he likely refined his manipulation techniques by observing other predators. Upon his release, he immediately began planning his next victim acquisition, demonstrating the calculated nature of his criminality. Philip exhibited classic traits of antisocial personality disorder combined with sexual sadism, explains Dr. Chen. His ability to maintain parole compliance while simultaneously holding Jaycee captive shows sophisticated planning and compartmentalization. He understood societal rules well enough to manipulate them while pursuing his deviant agenda. The couple's interaction with Jaycee evolved over the 18 years, reflecting their changing psychological needs. Initially, the focus was purely on Philip's sexual gratification and control. However, as Nancy's maternal delusions deepened and the children were born, the dynamic shifted toward a grotesque parody of family life. They began including Jaycee in mundane activities like grocery shopping and business dealings, always with the implicit threat of violence maintaining control. This evolution created additional psychological trauma for Jaycee, who had to navigate constantly shifting dynamics while protecting her daughters. The intermittent kindness shown by Nancy created particular confusion, as Jaycee's survival instincts told her to maintain positive relationships with both captors, while her rational mind recognized the fundamental horror of her situation. The Garridos' increasing boldness in the final years, bringing Jaycee to business meetings, allowing her to help with Philip's printing business, reflected their growing confidence that they had successfully broken their victim's will to escape. This overconfidence ultimately led to their downfall when Philip's erratic behavior during a UC Berkeley campus visit triggered the investigation that would finally free Jaycee. Understanding the psychological mechanics that sustained this horrific situation for nearly 2 decades provides crucial insights for preventing similar crimes and treating their aftermath. The sterile conference room at the FBI field office felt worlds away from the chaos of those first days after Jaycee's rescue. Special Agent Sarah Chen adjusted her reading glasses and spread the thick case files across the mahogany table, each manila folder representing years of investigative dead ends and missed opportunities that still haunted the Bureau. The Garrido case fundamentally changed how we approach long-term abduction cases, Chen explained. her voice carrying the weight of hard-learned lessons. When we analyzed the timeline, we found at least 14 separate occasions where law enforcement had contact with Philip Garrido during Jaycee's captivity. 14 chances. The admission hung heavy in the air. Chen had joined the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit specifically because of cases like this, the ones that exposed the terrifying reality of how predators could hide in plain sight, manipulating systems designed to protect the public. Garrido was a master manipulator, she continued, pulling out surveillance photos from his parole visits. He understood exactly how to present himself to authority figures. Compliant, remorseful, even helpful, classic psychopathic behavior, he could become whoever he needed to be in any given moment. The photos showed a man who seemed almost ordinary, unremarkable in his ability to blend into society's background. But Chen knew that beneath that carefully constructed facade lived a predator who had perfected the art of deception over decades. What we discovered during our post-rescue analysis was chilling, Chen said, opening another file. Garrido had been escalating for years before Jaycee's abduction. We traced a pattern of increasingly bold behaviors, exposing himself to children, stalking potential victims, testing boundaries. The 1976 rape conviction in Nevada should have been a red flag, but the system failed to recognize the true level of danger he represented. She pulled out a detailed timeline, color-coded and cross-referenced with painstaking precision. The psychology of someone who could maintain this level of deception for 18 years is fascinating and terrifying. Garrido created an entire alternate reality where his actions were justified, even noble in his twisted worldview. He genuinely believed he was protecting Jaycee, that he had saved her. Chen's expertise in criminal psychology had led her to study dozens of similar cases, but the Garrido situation remained unique in its duration and complexity. Nancy Garrido's role cannot be understated, she emphasized. Female accomplices in these cases often serve as both enabler and normalizing agent. Her presence made the household seem less threatening to outside observers. Who suspects a middle-aged couple of harboring a kidnapping victim? The behavioral patterns Chen had identified extended far beyond the immediate crime. Garrido's religious delusions weren't separate from his criminal behavior, they were integrated into his justification system. He convinced himself that he was chosen, special, that normal rules didn't apply to him. This grandiose self-image is common among long-term offenders who maintain elaborate deceptions. She showed detailed notes from Garrido's psychological evaluations, conducted years after Jaycee's rescue. Even in custody, facing life in prison, he maintained that he had been a positive influence in Jaycee's life. The level of self-deception required to sustain that belief system is staggering. It speaks to a complete break from reality, carefully constructed and maintained over decades. Chen's voice grew more somber as she discussed the investigative failures. The 2006 visit by parole officers to the Garrido property was our closest call. They were literally feet away from discovering Jaycee and the children, but Garrido's ability to compartmentalize his life, to present only what he wanted authorities to see, worked perfectly. He had 18 years of practice. The case files contained hundreds of witness statements, many from neighbors who had noticed odd things but never quite connected the dots. This is the terrifying reality of how these predators operate, Chen explained. They rely on our social conditioning to mind our own business, to not probe too deeply into private family matters. Garrido weaponized our politeness and reluctance to interfere. But Chen's analysis wasn't limited to the perpetrators. Jaycee's psychological resilience is remarkable from a clinical standpoint, she said, her tone shifting to one of professional admiration. Her ability to adapt, to create meaning and purpose even in unimaginable circumstances, demonstrates an extraordinary capacity for psychological survival. She protected not just herself, but her daughters, maintaining hope and humanity in a situation designed to destroy both. The profiler closed the final file and looked up. What keeps me awake at night is knowing there are others out there, other Philip Garridos, other elaborate deceptions being maintained right now. This case taught us that evil doesn't always look like what we expect. Sometimes it looks like a helpful neighbor, a religious man seeking redemption, an ordinary couple living quietly in suburbia. Chen gathered her materials slowly, each movement deliberate. The psychological insights we gained from this case have informed our approach to hundreds of subsequent investigations. But the cost of that knowledge, 18 years of a young girl's life, is something that weighs on every agent who worked this case. We learned from our failures, but we can never forget them. The FBI profiler's voice carried a weight of professional detachment, but beneath it, something more human flickered as she reviewed the case files one final time. Agent Sarah Chen had spent 30 years analyzing the minds of predators, yet the Garrido case still haunted the quiet moments between other investigations. "What people don't understand," she said, adjusting her glasses as she spoke to the documentary cameras, "is that Philip Garrido wasn't some anomaly that appeared out of nowhere. He was an escalating offender who had been given multiple opportunities by a system that failed to recognize the true nature of his pathology." The interviewer pressed for details about the psychological profile that had been constructed after Jaycee's discovery. Chen pulled out a thick folder, its edges worn from years of reference. "When we finally had access to Garrido for extensive evaluation, what we found was a textbook case of a sexual sadist with psychopathic tendencies, complicated by substance abuse and what appeared to be genuine delusional thinking. But here's what's crucial. His delusions were selective. He could function normally when it served his purposes." She opened to a page filled with handwritten notes and psychological assessments. Garrido claimed to hear voices, said he was chosen by God for special purposes. Classic grandiose delusions. But notice how those delusions never interfered with his ability to maintain the compound, to manipulate parole officers, to present himself as a reformed man when necessary. That's not mental illness, that's calculation. The camera captured her pointing to a timeline on the wall, marking Garrido's progression from his first known offense in 1972 through Jaycee's kidnapping nearly 2 decades later. This is what we call behavioral escalation. Each offense became more sophisticated, more controlling. By 1991, he wasn't just seeking a victim, he was creating a completely controlled environment where he could play God. Chen's analysis shifted to Nancy Garrido, and her voice took on a different tone. Nancy presents a more complex psychological puzzle. She wasn't simply a victim herself, though that was part of her defense. She was what we call a complicit enabler, someone who found purpose and identity through participating in her husband's crimes. The profiler explained how Nancy had been present during the initial kidnapping, had helped maintain the captivity, had even been involved in caring for Jaycee's children. Nancy's psychology reveals how someone can become so psychologically dependent on an abuser that they begin to see themselves as protector rather than perpetrator. In her mind, she was helping Philip create a family, a delusion that allowed her to participate in 18 years of captivity while maintaining some sense of moral justification. The conversation turned to the mechanisms that had allowed the crimes to continue undetected for so long. Chen pulled out photographs of the backyard compound, pointing to the sophisticated concealment methods. This wasn't random or impulsive. The level of planning, the construction of multiple structures, the soundproofing, this demonstrates what we call criminal sophistication. Garrido spent months, possibly years, preparing this environment. He understood exactly what he intended to do. But it was Chen's analysis of Jaycee's survival that carried the most weight. She spoke carefully, respectfully, about the psychological adaptations that had kept an 11-year-old girl alive in an impossible situation. Jaycee's story illustrates something we see in long-term captivity cases, the development of extraordinary psychological resilience alongside trauma bonding. She learned to read her captors' moods, to anticipate their needs, to make herself valuable rather than disposable. These weren't character flaws, they were survival skills. Chen emphasized how Jaycee's focus on her daughters had provided crucial psychological anchoring. When she became a mother, that gave her something beyond survival to fight for. It created meaning in a meaningless situation and provided motivation that transcended her own suffering. The profiler's voice softened as she discussed Jaycee's recovery journey. What's remarkable isn't just that she survived, but how she's chosen to rebuild. The fact that she can speak publicly about her experience, that she's created a foundation to help other victims, that she's maintained relationships with her daughters despite the circumstances of their birth. This demonstrates psychological strength that goes far beyond mere survival. As the interview concluded, Chen reflected on the broader implications of the case. The Garrido case forced us to re-examine how we monitor high-risk offenders, how we investigate missing children cases, and how we support long-term survivors. Jaycee's courage in speaking out has literally changed how we approach these investigations. She closed the case file, but her expression remained thoughtful. Philip Garrido will die in prison, as he should. Nancy will serve her sentence. But Jaycee chose to transform her survival into something that protects other children. That's not just recovery, that's triumph over evil in its purest form. The cameras stopped rolling, but Chen remained seated, staring at the photograph of a smiling 11-year-old girl who had simply been walking to school on a sunny morning in 1991, never imagining how her story would ultimately become one of the most powerful testimonies to human resilience ever documented.